Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I am going to be talking about a brand new report that has come out today. It's called Energy Vampires: The AI Data Centers Draining Australia. I wrote this report as the lead author, along with a bunch of really lovely people from Greenpeace Australia Pacific. We really wanted to look into the whole issue of data center growth in Australia and how it affects the energy transition. Australia is a country that is teetering in the middle. There's a lot of coal plants that are lingering longer than they're meant to. And there are also a lot of amazing successes in renewable energy. And so it is really a very, very important place to be studying when it comes to this issue. I'm going to go through most of the report. This will be a nice, meaty presentation. You can probably find shorter videos online of me talking about the report, but this will be the full ride. So let's get into it. The report's kind of in three chunks. The first chunk is about what happens when you put a data center onto the power grid in Australia. What is happening? Oh, I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller. There we go. I'll move myself around as I go through the presentation. This is something that I think people probably have the most familiarity with in Australia, is what happens when you have a very large amount of new load from data centers. And what we found when we were putting this report together is that Australia's level of data center growth is surprisingly significant. So what we can see here is that for the last year, from the first quarter of 2025 to the first quarter of 2026, Australia had about 50% of its demand growth coming from data centers. Now, the top chart here, you should note very carefully that this axis is truncated. So the demand increase was actually kind of only a fraction of a percent. It was 25,194 megawatts on average in Q1 in 2025, up to 25,496. So the level of demand growth in Australia is not bonkers. But of the demand growth that did happen, about half of it was data centers, more in actually in Victoria than in New South Wales. And that proportion of demand growth is only matched by the United States in terms of all the different regions of the world and the proportion of demand growth from data centers. And I've also got a chart down here showing the emissions disclosures from the main data center operators in Australia. We've got AirTrunk, Amazon, NextDC, CDC, Equinix. AirTrunk really has, I would say, the most significant increase in emissions there, but really all of them have roughly the same pattern, which is over the past sort of 5 years, a very significant increase. In addition to this growth, what we've actually seen, this is a piece of data that was released after the conclusion of this report, after we locked down the text, that we can see that the level of growth from data center energy consumption, most of which is in New South Wales, about a year ago switched from this kind of linear growth that you see along here from 2018 to about 2025. And now it's really switched to a very significant increase in power demand over the past year that reflects what has been disclosed by the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, who operate the largest grid, which is the National Electricity Market. This is also something you can detect in the amount of spending on the bits and pieces that actually go into a data center. The little, racks and computers and processors and things like that. That level of spending increased so significantly, about 2 years ago. But in the last year in particular, that level of spending has really, really skyrocketed. So a lot is changing very fast. I really like this graphic that was provided in a post a few days ago by an organization called Modo Energy. They're really clever and I like their work. And they show for Australia that the projections, this is the kind of purple line, this is their projection of data center growth in Australia, show very significant change over the next few years. Over the next 10 years, it's basically, like 8 times as much-ish, a little bit more than that. And that is not unusual. We've seen many different forecasts of this kind. But the really important thing to me is that of that growth, just under half of it is already under construction. So this is not stuff that is really, like vague ideas or concepts or anything like that. And they show that there is actually a pipeline of early stage ideas that are just many, many times, it wouldn't fit on this chart, many, many times larger than the pipeline that they show here. They've kind of filtered it out for the most likely projects. And this is just a really nice list that they also provide. You can see the size of these data centers, relatively substantial. The number one biggest is the Munro Road campus in Western Sydney, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Just to give you another sense of the scale of data center growth in Australia, these are the 2025 projections. So this has actually been updated, a week ago to be a little bit higher. So this is, I guess, somewhat underestimating the growth. But I guess the key takeaway is that really, electrification of homes and businesses and electrification of electrification of road transport are all in competition, essentially, in terms of the amount of energy demand, electricity grid demand from data centers. This is not like a nothing burger. If you think that electric vehicles are significant, then you also kind of think that data centers are significant. Again, this is an underestimate of data center demand growth in Australia. This was prepared with the help of Dylan McConnell, who's someone who publishes this sort of data, and he's a researcher at the University of Melbourne, and he's a lovely guy, and he shared this data which shows the change in forecasts. The orange line here is the old 2024, which is just wild, thinking about 2024 was really not that long ago. And the projection, this is the middle case, right? Like this isn't even really considering advanced data center growth, has increased many, many times over in just 2 short years. And I guess something really important to note here as well is that right here, you can see that the level of data center demand in FY25 actually ended up not double, but maybe 20 to 30% higher than what was anticipated by the grid operator 2 years ago. So it's growing faster than anyone expected, really, and it's actuals. It's not just the projections increasing. This was in the Australian Energy Market Operators Forecasting Report, and I think it just shows something really important, which is that what we see, what the numbers that I've used in this report, which is last year's electricity statement of opportunities projections, are adjusted. It's not just the pipeline of data centers who are trying to get connected. It's actually sort of filtered out somewhat to see the projects that are likely to go ahead. And it's just really remarkable how different it is when you look at the projects that are planned. It's pretty unusual for an industry to say in their defense most of the projects that are planned are kind of junk projects. We go into this a little bit in the report because it is just so odd that they call it phantom demand. I'm going to call them junk projects here. And it's really just a strange defense to say, don't worry, our whole pipeline is dominated by cowboys who don't really want to build data centers. I feel like that's a problem. But of course, for the purposes of this report, I'm not using these more speculative projects. I'm using the Australian Energy Market Operators numbers. This demand growth is going to be very significant, and this is kind of one of the headline figures as we dug into the planning documents behind this project, the Munro Road mega project. It's Australia's equal biggest, and the level of greenhouse gas emissions that it will spur by connecting onto the power grid in Australia is gigantic. It's about the same as all the domestic flights in New South Wales in 2023. And this is so significant because these are just massive numbers that will have a material impact on New South Wales' emissions targets, particularly for the power grid. It'll do things like help coal plants extend their lifespan. I argue in the report that the Eraring extension that occurred recently, this Australia's biggest coal-fired power station, was extended for a few more years, resulting in many, many megatons of additional emissions and air pollution. is related to this rising projection of power demand in the future. It helped justify that extension. That is a really bad thing. It's something we see globally. This is the International Energy Agency report from a few months back called Key Questions on Energy and AI. Sorry, I should say a few weeks back. And this is the graphic showing the type of new electricity generation that will be spurred by the addition of new data center demand. And you can see really, really clearly that actually some renewables and some nuclear do grow in response to data centers plugging into the grid. Great. But coal and gas also grow. And that means that the net impact of these data center additions will be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, including sucking up some of the resources for renewables that should have gone towards cutting down fossil fuels. So I would argue this somewhat understates the impact, the climate impact of future data center demand growth through to 2030. This is also a nice graphic showing the Energy Information Administration in the US, which is really not an organization now, under the Trump administration that I expect to be, championing the climate cause. But even they kind of have to admit that data center growth results in a material increase in coal and gas. That difference, this space here, is massive. This is kind of like one Australian or a good chunk of an Australian power grid here just being added onto the United States emissions. Not good. Australia's own government agencies like the Department of Climate Change, Energy and Water, the Climate Change Authority have all had to admit in their projections and recommendations for targets that data center growth is a major factor in weakening projections of the future. And that's basically, as you can see in this chart, the level of power demand projected for Australia. Consequently, the level of power generation is increasing, and the projected increase in renewables is not keeping pace with that, which means the only way that the formula gets solved is by saying, well, coal and gas are just going to have to generate more unless we have stronger renewable growth. And I'll come to that in a moment. Unless we have stronger renewable growth, you're not going to have a lot of luck. This line has been used a lot. Because basically, data centers will spur the energy transition. They'll kind of cause a big boost in renewable energy, and that's kind of job done. That deals with the whole climate problem. And this is really something that we thought we have to interrogate this. We have to really look, step back from the hype and look at the data and look at the climate imperatives. This is a nice example of a graphic that was used in the Sydney Morning Herald. New South Wales Treasurer Daniel Mookie basically says, if we get this right, we're going to have the cash to pay for the renewable transition. And we get into it in this report. This is really, really, really crucial. I think this is something that is poorly understood. You can have a situation where demand is growing a little bit and renewables are going really well. And what happens is that some of those renewables get used to meet that new demand, but most of it actually cuts down deep into fossil fuels. This is what climate action looks like, this chart here. And you can see really nicely, this is made up data. I wanted to just demonstrate a point here. What you can see is that when you have a situation of extreme demand growth, then you basically have fossil fuels growing alongside renewables. And this is a situation that we do not like. We want to avoid it. Australia, the national electricity market in particular, has been in this situation here up the top. Look at Texas, and you will see something that looks roughly like this down at the bottom, which is where some renewables have been growing. But actually, demand has been growing so quickly that fossil fuels have also been growing. And as a result, Texas's emissions have been rising. This was kind of confirmed by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in a report they released last year. It was done by the consultancy Baringa. And they modeled a few different emission scenarios. Basically, what happens if you have a whole bunch of data center demand? They actually used the pipeline from when they did the report. So it was old, this is understating the impact on emissions growth. And so when you have a lot of new data centers and no additional renewables, as in nothing beyond what would have happened anyway, then of course you get an increase in emissions, as I've described previously. The effect is that it lifts all the boats on the power grid, solar, wind, hydro, coal, gas, and the net effect, if you have any increase in coal or any increase in gas, emissions will be higher. There is just no escaping that fact. They also modeled these green scenarios where they look at additional amounts of renewable energy to actually cover that new demand, 3.2 gigawatts. And the three different scenarios are different levels of batteries, 0.95 and 1.9 gigawatts of batteries. And you can basically see the upside is almost nothing, right? Like it's like a very slight. So if data centers get built and they cover 100% of their new demand, even with a whole bunch of batteries, there's only a very slight emissions reduction. If they do not cover their demand with additional renewable energy, the downside is very, very significant. That is a good percentage increase in emissions for these different states. That is huge, right? 22% increase in emissions for New South Wales. And that's really remarkable. I think this is an idea that people don't quite realize or recognize, is that even in the perfect scenario where they cover 100% of everything new that they build with renewables, all they're really doing is breaking even. They're cleaning up their own mess. They're not actually helping the energy transition. They are just dealing with the impacts of their own presence on the grid. So are they doing that? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, data centers are already demanding a fair amount on the power grids in Australia. So what are they doing? Are they building new clean energy? The majority of the claims that they make around this relate to something known as a power purchasing agreement, or PPA. This is basically when they do a deal with a wind farm or a solar farm. We're going to get built anyway as a data center, so we may as well buy some renewable energy from a project that's struggling to get up and running. It makes sense if it's a new project and that intervention results in that wind farm or solar farm being built. That makes sense. But what if it was going to happen anyway? Then you're kind of just buying your power from the wind farm, and it doesn't really make a difference to the total state of the grid. You have as many wind farms present as there would have been had you done nothing. And so that actually doesn't result in decreased emissions, right? So you end up with the addition of a data center, but no new renewables. And there are some quotes in our report that we surface that really just talk about how the fact that these power purchasing deals are occurring often for projects that are already going to be going ahead. The Climate Council talks about this. Rod Sims talks about this. It is quite a bad state of affairs. The industry lobby group is called Data Centers Australia, and they repeat this number a lot, right? They talk about how they've covered 70% of their demand. It's actually 62%. I don't know. I calculated, maybe there's like a rounding thing. But basically they say they've covered about 2/3 of their existing energy demand with renewable energy. They use the word offset. I'm not going to use it here because it's confusing. It's a different thing. They basically say they've adjusted their grid power demand, and they say about 2/3 of it, chill out. Those emissions aren't real. We're offsetting it, or we're adjusting it with renewable energy. We dig into those claims and we look at the use of renewable energy credits, and they are weak claims to basically be saying we bought these renewable energy certificates that are created when a wind farm or a solar farm generates electricity, and we are saying that project exists because of our purchase. And it was kind of maybe true like in the early 2010s when I was in the wind industry in Australia, but it is not true anymore. And so we consider that to be a weak claim, and this is an internationally held position really from scholars and analysts who really just say that you can't buy these renewable credits and kind of claim that your emissions are zero. Power purchasing agreements are perhaps more likely to get a wind project off the ground or a solar project off the ground, but only if you do it at an early stage and you kind of prove that your intervention was the thing that got it off the ground. And we looked into whether or not they're proving this. And they kind of aren't. It's really hard to find substantiation of this claim that these are truly additional new renewable energy facilities. They say 70% new renewable energy, and I really don't think that they have the evidence to support that. When you look at the amount of energy that they currently demand, they can't even cover that with actual new renewable energy facilities. Even if you take their word for these two questionable claims, they are still only 62% of the way there. And that's remarkable. Why can't they cover even just what their existing demand is? If they claim to be a major source of climate action and helping the renewable transition. There was a joint letter a few weeks ago by, I think it was sort of helmed by Carbon Zero, WWF signed on, a bunch of other organizations, basically just saying the bare minimum is that you cover off your new demand with 100% actual new, real, additional renewable energy projects that would not have happened otherwise. On top of existing renewable energy, remember the Clean Energy Finance Corporation models. If it's not truly additional, then you're basically going along a sliding scale of how much harm you cause. So at the very least, at least this idea stops them from causing additional harm to climate. And the industry and the data center lobby group do not like this concept at all. They really, really don't like it. They basically switch from this tone of saying, look how amazing we are with renewables. We can fund the energy transition. We can be the ones to lift Australia's renewable energy growth and make climate action happen. And then as soon as this mandate gets suggested, they're like, no. We really can't do this. There is not enough renewable energy projects. There are too many grid constraints. They switch from a tone of heroic intervention to a tone of passive helplessness. The Australian Energy Market Commission is going to be investigating this concept of how to actually get data centers to fully invest in 100% renewable energy. That's great, but there will be a fight around the definition of 100% renewable. There will be a fight around the term additional, and the industry will be scrambling to make this regulation as weak as they possibly can. And you need to watch them closely. You need to really pay attention to what they're doing and saying to make this process something that doesn't actually result in proper additional new renewable energy. Again, just to cover the harm that they do and not beyond that. I'm going to move my face here a little bit. I'm going to make myself tiny so you can actually look at this. Oh, look how small I am. I'm so small. So I wanted to depict these different scenarios, right? Imagine lots of data centers being built with relatively few new renewables. It's voluntary. They kind of throw out a few power purchasing agreements to brag about it. But it's not very much, and the level of new data center consumption is way, way higher than the output of the new renewables that they suggest. That is the worst emissions impact of these scenarios, and it is the current position of Australia's data center lobby group. Less bad is the joint statement position from Carbon Zero and WWF, etc. This would have almost no emissions impact. I would argue it would have some emissions impact because clean technology gets diverted away from doing things like cutting down on fossil fuels. It's already heavily constrained in Australia. There is a massive shortage of renewable energy growth. There was just a new report from the Clean Energy Council out yesterday about that. I would recommend having a look at it. It's a little bit grim. But let's be nice here and say this is kind of no emissions impact. The other possibility is that you have the same amount of data center growth and they somehow manage to build more new renewables than the data centers that they actually build. Very, very unlikely. No one's proposing this as a concept that I've seen in Australia. And that would reduce emissions. Like that would actually help the energy transition and cause some reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on the power grid. I don't think it's going to happen. It really, if they cannot manage this absolute bare minimum scenario up here, then I don't think they're going to make it to having significantly more renewable energy than the new data centers. And this is our position here at Greenpeace Australia Pacific. When we put together this report, we actually say that demand from data centers needs to be limited. And we call for a moratorium. I'll come to that a little bit later. But this is one of the key justifications, is that this is the scenario in which deep emissions cuts occur, alongside a very significant increase in renewable energy growth, which, organizations like Greenpeace Australia Pacific and others cover elsewhere. That is the scenario when emissions really fall, is when you have deep emissions cuts and you put a lid on growth, on demand growth, so that it's freed up for things like electrification. It's freed up for things like keeping people alive in heat waves. There are very, very important and critical uses for the power grid in this context of mitigating emissions and adapting to climate. And data centers do not justify themselves in this scenario. I'm going to get to the actual purposes that they serve a little bit later on. I'm going to make myself big again. Guitar's getting bigger. Here we go. Okay. All right. This section's kind of a little bit easier to understand, I think. Really, this is the phenomenon of literally plugging a gas-fired power station into a data center. It's easy, this is not complicated. This is basically when a data center developer gets impatient with the grid connection stuff that I've talked about previously and says, you know what, stuff it. I'm going to just build my own gas-fired power station. It is something that is happening a lot in the United States. They have this perfect storm of concern about angry locals when you connect your data center onto the power grid. Power prices go up, and so they're really concerned about the politics of that. They're impatient. They want their investments to make sense, so they have to build the data center as soon as possible. And then they also have a growing relationship between the fossil fuel industry and big tech. And all those things are not phenomena that are unique to America. This is something that actually you see in many places in the world. This is the International Energy Agency report's Key Questions on Energy and AI that was released a few weeks ago. And I took their estimates of gas power for data centers. Again, they've really filtered out all of the junk here. These are just likely. In fact, the International Energy Agency used satellite data to examine which projects are actually under construction, and they can visibly see the buildings on the satellite images. So this is a good estimate of future gas power construction for data centers. In the worst case scenario, by 2030, the total emissions of this fleet of gas-fired power for data centers will have higher emissions than the total power grid of Italy or Pakistan. Even when you look at the individual gas-fired power projects, the level of emissions are massive, bigger than many countries. This is a fantastic article in Wired, published by Molly Taft. I recommend that you go have a peek at it. It's a fantastic read, and we reproduced some of the data that they present there. It's really quite remarkable. But this is really, really important. Gas-fired data centers are a threat in many places outside of the United States. In Canada, Mark Carney actually changed the rules to ease the permitting of gas-powered data centers after direct lobbying by fossil fuel companies. That is remarkable. There is an amazing story in DSMOG about a gas turbine manufacturer going to this data center conference in Europe quite recently and basically just saying, I think the American market is ahead of us. The same thing is going to happen here. Here is Europe. It will just take a bit longer and it will be a bit harder because people will be saying, hang on a minute, we don't want to be burning greenhouse gases, which is an amazing quote. And I was so happy we managed to include that before we locked down the text of this report. And it shows you that this is really a global phenomenon in the United Kingdom as well. There's 100 data center facilities that are just waiting desperately to connect to the gas grid so they can burn gas. The Cloud Carrier project in New South Wales is one hell of a project. I don't think people realize this, It is bigger than either Colossus 1 or Colossus 2, which are the data centers initially powering Elon Musk's Grok chatbot, and now powering Claude through a deal with Anthropic. These are the data centers that have been getting a lot of extremely critical coverage thanks to the unpermitted nature of the gas turbines that they've built, and are absolutely choking the black community in which they're situated in Memphis and Tennessee. It is a really, really grim story. I have written a bunch of stuff about these projects, and the Cloud Carrier project in New South Wales, which is a proposed data center that wants to build a 700 megawatt gas-fired power station, is bigger than either of these facilities. There have been many protests at this Cloud Carrier site over the most recent weekend for the time of recording, and the locals are really infuriated, correctly, that this gas-fired power station is being proposed. But for this report, we decided to look at the permitting documents that have already been submitted. There is not a lot. And so we had to create an emissions estimate for this project ourselves, just by going by the type of gas turbines that are proposed and their emissions intensity. But we did find a statement in their New South Wales planning submission that basically says the emissions from this facility will be lower than the coal-dominated grid in New South Wales. And if you're kind of scanning that, you might go, oh yeah, that sounds like reasonable. Okay, fair enough. We did the numbers and we found that this gas-fired power station, because New South Wales is cleaning up its grid, renewable energy is growing. If it were to connect to the grid, it would have substantial emissions. But if it were to be fueled by gas for its lifespan, that is many, many, many times greater greenhouse gas emissions than connecting to the grid. And it's really important. Using gas to power a data center is an absolute emissions nightmare. It is such a big deal. It is so bad. And inspired by that, and also a story about the UK's government having to significantly revise its emissions estimate for data centers upwards because they excluded gas originally, we decided to do a similar analysis, but for the projected data center demand. Again, remember, we are using estimates from 2025, and they have been revised upwards a few weeks ago, so this is an underestimate of the greenhouse gas emissions in these different scenarios. And I also did not do a complex model for the grid-connected emissions for data centers. So this is, in fact, a lower emissions estimate than what the Clean Energy Finance Corporation published last year. So I kind of just wanted to be as nice as possible to the data center industry. But even a quarter of that data center demand in the future being powered by gas rather than connecting to the grid results in 2.8 times the level of climate harm. That is so bad, right? that is a big deal. Half gas is significantly more. There is another proposed project that I don't think has actually been submitted to any planning bodies that we could find, but this was basically suggested by the head of an organization called Tamboran Energy. They are a gas company in Australia. And the CEO was talking about this concept called the Beetaloo Compute Zone, and it is basically located directly next to one of their massive gas fields that they're proposing, and they suggest a 5 gigawatt data center. And you know what? I mean, maybe this wouldn't go ahead. Maybe this was just the head of a gas company talking up their own book. But to give you a sense of scale of the dreams, I guess, or the fantasies that are being said out loud, that would be larger than all but 6 rather of the 71 proposed gas-fired data centers in the United States. It would basically be bigger than most proposed gas-fired data centers in the US. It's equal with the Chevron AI data center project. And so this is just not something that the head of an organization should really be able to say without experiencing massive scrutiny and pushback in Australia. And it really just kind of went by without a peep. And we find that to be really, really remarkable and problematic, because this is a nutty concept. And if it were to go ahead even a tenth of this project, the emissions impact is still really, really significant. I should just add, if this project, if the Tamboran project went ahead, it would be double all the entire Northern Territory's greenhouse gas emissions. And just to highlight, back to my modeling of what happens if, you know, a small proportion of gases of data centers are powered by gas. Even if it was just 1 in 2, even if half of that new data center capacity were powered by gas, it would have more emissions in the entire power sector of Portugal or Sweden. This is something that they're pushing for. This is something that they're actively trying every day to make happen. Again, this is Tamboran Energy. Sorry, no, my mistake. This is Beach Energy. This is the head of Beach Energy, Brett Woods. And he is talking about the level of data center demand soaring and how gas will be the obvious answer to that. Last week, there was the main conference of Australia's main fossil fuel lobby group. They're called Australian Energy Producers. They changed their name to remove the fossil part, as if that's fooling anyone. And this is a panel sponsored by Chevron, and featuring someone, the head of Data Centers Australia, the lobby group, someone from Google, someone from the fossil fuel company Beach Energy, and someone from Chevron. I don't know what they said on this panel. I've really struggled to to get a recording or anything like that, which is a shame. But yeah, it's a bad one, because I think it really illustrates that they are talking about the potential for gas to be fueling data centers, and you know, I really don't think that Data Centers Australia were there pushing back against that message and being representatives for the climate and saying we need to protect the energy transition and say no to gas powering data centers. I seriously doubt that, but I don't know. If anyone has a recording, please tell me. I'd love to. I'd love to see it. There is another one coming up soon. This is a data center industry conference. And of course, you can actually see major fossil fuel companies like Origin Energy. Wärtsilä are a manufacturer of gas turbines. They are the event partner. Origin Energy, another gas company, they are the event partner as well. And so, yeah, when you look into this, and we detail many, many, many more examples in the report, there are close connections. There is a force, a pressure emerging from these relationships to make Australia's data center growth powered by gas rather than the grid. We really wanted to go beyond the technicalities and the energy and emissions data in this report. Consider this to be very important, and we wanted to talk about transparency and purpose as well. On transparency, the data center lobby group has been fighting really, really hard against actually disclosing information about each facility, about each data center. Here in Europe, Digital Europe, which is a lobby group, made the submission, and the wording from their submission was copy-pasted into the final EU Commission's wording in terms of the actual information for individual data centers being commercial in confidence. And so, you know, we do not get to see that, and that's really that's a real problem, because communities, when they're considering the impact of data centers, they want to know something like how much energy will it consume, what impact will it have on the power grid, how often will the diesel generators be running. All of this information is extremely vital, and they are fighting very hard not to disclose it. Amazon and Canberra Data Centers, CDC, also both fought very hard to not have to disclose their company-wide emissions and energy data to the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, NGERS. That is remarkable. Their justifications, of course, were that it was trade secrets, and we can look at their data now. They lost these fights, and so we look at their data, and I would love someone to tell me what actionable information you can glean from the fact that Amazon and CDC have rising climate impacts. All I see in terms of information there is that they have a business model that doesn't care about climate impacts. So I don't know, maybe that's a secret. I guess it is. But yeah, this is a ridiculous argument, basically, that this is all secret, mega special business secrets. And it's just not, this is really, they just don't want scrutiny of the extremely serious impact that they're having. When you look at the marketing and the sort of like social media materials of data center lobby groups and representatives and advocates, they really often talk about the functions of data centers. They talk about like business calls and like file storage and social media and things like that. But they really don't talk about slop, the production of text, images, and videos that are corrosive, that are damaging to society, whether it's through low quality or actual abusive actions. As I mentioned earlier, the Grok data centers were producing abusive imagery, and we just simply do not know for data centers in Australia what services they will be providing. They do not tell you. They really did not like this suggestion when it was put forth in that open letter from a few weeks ago. They really resisted it strongly. They almost kind of scoffed at the concept. But I think that they are a factory. They are a big energy-intensive factory, and we've never experienced a factory that refuses to tell you what they're making in the factory. If you can imagine a big building and it's just like, no, you're not allowed to know whether this is making iron ore or weapons, or whether it's storing immigrants. Like it's just a shocking thing to not disclose what a factory is doing. And I don't think that data centers get to be excluded or exempted from being honest with a community about the purpose that they're serving. And so this is a really, really strong point in this report that we put together, basically saying the level of harm potentially from the functions being served by data centers, which get falsely summarized as all being critical infrastructure, can actually be really, really negative for a community. So not only is a community suffering negative impacts, rising power bills, worse air quality, all the various impositions that a data center brings, that are doing it for bad reasons, right? They're doing it for socially corrosive reasons. And so this is really important to us. All right, so I want to talk about the recommendations that we have. And I think, I think these are really strong recommendations and a very, very necessary intervention in Australia's data center debate that has not, I think, considered in detail the actual purpose and the reasons for data centers being built. And I think this is really important. So the biggest one, of course, is a moratorium on data center development. We are seeing moratoria emerge across political spectra, in the United States and in many other parts of the world. It is really, again, not just a United States thing. We detail examples of moratoria. Then probably the best example is in Dublin. These are temporary pauses on data center development to allow rationality and calm and engineering and safety to come back into the conversation. We really feel like the rush, the impatience is part of the problem. That is why fossil fuels are being chosen, even though renewables are far cheaper, is because it is really just quicker to take the dirty route. And combine that with the lobbying from the fossil fuel industry, and you end up with the bad situations that we're seeing now. So data center growth really needs to be returned to rationality and sense. And I think this is a really powerful call, and I think that it's going to have a very positive impact in that it'll really encourage everybody to think about the fact that this is not happening in a clear-headed way, and the very physical, real, material impacts of rapid data center growth are something that we already know is emerging around the world and causing a lot of damage. While that moratorium is in place, approvals need to be implemented that actually truly safeguard communities significantly stricter planning processes. If there's any way that whatever data centers that do survive can help renewable energy beyond just covering their own growth, but actually reducing emissions and helping the energy transition, then that should happen. That should have to happen. And I think that really the urgency of the energy transition means that the data center industry can't be either an industry that refuses to clean up its own mess or a passive participant that kind of picks up wind and solar projects for their own needs and ignores the actual broader situation. That is another American individualistic trait that you see in companies like Amazon and Microsoft, who don't like to think about the system or the trajectory for the country. And then disclosure just has to be real. This is really, really important. I think that energy and emissions, obviously, and when a company claims that they're covering themselves with renewable energy, prove it. It shouldn't be that hard to ask, to say, okay, show me the new renewable energy projects, show me what they're generating, show me what you're consuming, and prove it. Prove that you've actually covered yourself. It's not that hard. If they claim it, then they should have to prove it. There should really be just no argument about that. And in terms of their purpose and whether they're actually critical infrastructure or not, again, this is something that they talk about constantly. They make the claim. They say data centers are doing X, Y, and Z. And again, in our report, our biggest point is just prove it. If you make the claim, then you should have to provide evidence. If you say that this data center is critical infrastructure, prove that you need 1 gigawatt of compute capacity to run a hospital spreadsheet. Prove it. And I think that will make a huge difference. And I think that it will be very important to at least have people asking these questions, if not actual regulation put in place, forcing companies to not just say these things, but do these things. Thank you. That's my little fox. It's really cute. Greenpeace have fantastic slides. I like that.